Look, I'm very pleased to be here to say a few words on what is really a very important occasion, in my view, for the history of science and technology in the long 18th century. As Sophie explained, the protean character of the Board of Longitude means that its documentary remains take us into numerous aspects of the science and industrial arts of the period, from the Board's foundation in 1714 to its demise in 1828. And the papers also illuminate the developing relations of science and the state, as well as the interactions between men of science, voyages of exploration and discovery, the world of commerce and the projectors. They do a lot more besides. And so this is the great value of and significance of making these papers available to anyone who has a connection to what I like to call the worldwide interweb, no matter what their latitude or their longitude. And the excellent research that's been done by investigators and students working on this project already squeezes some of the juice out of these materials, but only some. And there's lots more we can take comfort for, as other researchers, to extract. Many more significances to find amongst them. So what I'm going to do, I hope you forgive me, I'm going to indulge in a few partly autobiographical and in many ways almost random reflections on navigating longitude from various physical and disciplinary vantage points. The Board of Longitude was, I gather, in part, the project was, I gather, in part a response to the simple stories that were being told about the history of longitude in the late 20th century, especially the stories promulgated with great success, or at least popular acclaim, by Davis Sabel, about a certain Yorkshire clockmaker, John Harrison, a dour, persistent character with an eye firmly fixed on pocketing the prize. Now, like being myself from Keighley, as you've heard, like Herbert Butterfield actually, being a trifle chippy and fond of stereotypes, you might allow me my own favourite definition of a Yorkshireman. I won't bring the Scots into it, that's another one. But a Yorkshireman is blessed with short arms and deep pockets. For Harrison, I'm sure pocketing the prize was just a preliminary to hanging on to it. Thomas King, who painted this portrait, clearly didn't have a very good sense of proportion. The arms are much too long. Now, Sabel, to be fair, wrote in imitation of some of the scholarship on the longitude question that had already pitted caricatures of Harrison as hero against those of the Reverend Neville Maskelyne as villain. Whig history with its heroes and villains, and firstism with its, where historians enter into combat on behalf of candidate inventors and discoverers. These are ever-present temptations in academic work, especially if, like me, your default position is that of biographer. The layers of Whiggery that had already shaped the longitude story by the time Sabel got hold of it needed to be unpeeled, and I think the Longitude project has done that, but a great deal besides. The story of longitude, as you all know, is much more than Harrison versus Maskelyne. The careful study of the records of institutions encourages a very important corrective, it seems to me, to biography-based research. Institutions remain strangely unfashionable targets of inquiry in historical scholarship today. They're about due for a revival, and I suspect that the Longitude project is at the leading edge of that process. The papers show us, for example, the adaptation of the institution to new derivative functions once the chief purpose for which it had been established had been met. Institutions acquire inertia, whilst at the same time extending and diversifying their roles. That's one of the reasons why they're such interesting and important beasts. Now, my own historical interest in the Board of Longitude arose for rather parochial reasons. I forgot to show you Maskelyne. The board was one of the institutions relevant to the squabbles that went on in the early 19th century reforming Royal Society. This was the late phase of the board's existence when it became a general state-funded research institution of considerable importance to the astronomical community as well as the maritime and instrument-making community. Hence derived the scientific reformers' interest in the board. So as a callow, this is where the autobiography comes in, as a callow first-year graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania in 75, 76, not the Middle Ages as my students often think, I first came across discussions about the board. I was looking at the John Herschel correspondence and I was reading it in microfilm. Now there's a medium for you. At the American Philosophical Society Library. I was working as a research assistant to my supervisor, Arnold Thackeray. He and my good friend Jack Morrell were in the final stages of the work that became the book Gentlemen of Science on the British Association for the Advancement of Science. I remember, incidentally, having one in retrospect is quite a cringe-inducing conference with Arnold, in which I insisted, with both my feet completely soggy from spending so much time in my mouth, that it was the board of longitude, not the Board of Longitude. And this misconception, which for a long time was kind of impervious to print, went back to a geography master of mine in Bradford who taught us about latitude and longitude. Anyway, towards the end of a thesis research trip to the UK in 1978, I'd been terminologically re-educated, and I was almost terminally exhausted from hauling around briefcases full of index cards and handwritten pencil notes. I examined material then relating to the board's later years, made lots of notes, accumulated more cards, bought another briefcase, but I hardly realized what a rich archive I was dipping into. Researchers these days have a very different experience. Archives are increasingly at our globally roaming fingertips, fingertips powered by otherwise underdeveloped upper bodies slouched in ergonomic chairs. Muscular archival research is in serious decline. Whatever the nature of our access then to the online universe, place appears less important than it used to be. Or does it? Well, it seems to me, on the contrary, that place continues to make its mark, whether the researcher goes to the archive or the archive comes to the researcher. The Board of Longitude obviously means different things. For example, to the student of the history of scientific instruments in Greenwich and the student of settler sovereignty in Sydney, or for the navigators among you in latitude 33.8683 degrees south, longitude 151.2086 degrees east. If we admit disciplines as place, and we should, then the board's archives certainly take on different significances depending upon disciplinary situation. Economists will fall upon them hungrily because they promise, among other things, documentation of the working of an exemplary prize-giving approach to open innovation. The merits or otherwise of encouraging innovation by means of premiums or prizes, rather than by the temporary monopolies of patents, is much debated these days, as is collective innovation in open source communities. So the board's example has, on this view, something to say to the wiki world, and clearly the Prime Minister, David Cameron, thought it worthwhile to establish a new Longitude Prize for Innovation, which he and the Astronomer Royal announced last month. And our very own Rebecca Higgett, I notice, has had a say on this in The Guardian recently. Some practitioners of navigation, on the other hand, have argued that the history of the board is a case study in a delusory attempt to encourage innovations that would prevent the loss of ships and crews at sea. Delusory because these authors claim only new methods of propulsion that emerged in the decades after the board's demise were really able to do that. Most loss at sea, this argument goes, resulted from the vagaries of the weather and the force of storm and tempest. Only with steam power could these forces of nature be effectively resisted. From that perspective, then the respectable longitude solutions, notably the lunar distance and chronometric methods, were no more effective than the numerous outlandish schemes of the projectors that populate the board's records and that Larry talked about. I've got here in my script, all were folly, or not. The board's papers become, from this perspective, a sustained documentation of misdirected effort. This, it must be said, or at least I would say, is a misplaced critique. This is apparent once we realise that the public justification of longitude work in terms of preventing shipwreck had a strong PR element to it. Practitioners, as Owen Phillips explains in one of the very helpful bits of metadata in this collection, practitioners were looking to accurate longitude determination partly for safety and security, but also crucially as a way to shorten voyages and to reduce their expense. Going back to place in a geographical sense, there's no reason, of course, why my hometown of Sydney should not be the prime meridian. Some people I know think that it is. Australia could also be on top of the world rather than down under. Perhaps even without the need to thoughtfully designate the map showing it placed on top as being upside down. Australia could even be central, as in a marvellous map favoured by Alan Frost. There's no reason why not, except, of course, the reason of history. The historical achievement of the primacy of the Greenwich prime meridian was a product of the 19th century, but its basis was laid through a constellation of institutions in the late 18th century, including the Board of Longitude. Longitude is itself attached to place as much as defining it. Indeed, one depends on the other. So only by being parochial, only by defining somewhere, and it may as well be Greenwich, as the prime meridian, could longitude have success in signifying universally. Now, the invention, and here I'm coming at some of the things that, in fact, Patricia, in her last question, started to raise. The invention and discovery of longitude was, at one level, part of what the sociologist Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, a process substituting scientific measurement for the richness of place, with its varied characteristics and diverse associations in the world as enchanted garden. David Sabel, as some of you will know, habitually adds the latitude and longitude as well as the date to her autograph. She duly annotated a copy of longitude for me, 41 north, 72 west, approximately, denoting Schenectady, New York, where we bumped into each other some years ago. Fortunately, as you see, the annotation also carries the generous message, happy to meet you at the latitude and longitude of Langmuir, and no ill effects. And this renders the inscription more enchanting than not by indicating what that place meant to me. I mean, I was working on the industrial chemist Irving Langmuir in the General Electric archives, and what it meant to Dava. She was the keynote speaker at the 150th anniversary of the Dudley Observatory. And also what it meant to us, the two of us there together. We had a long and useful chat about the popularization of the history of science. Of course, as this shows, the disenchantment produced by labeling place as longitude might masquerade as total, but it could never be so. Context was always crucial in the complex practices of measuring longitude. Whether longitude was being determined by chronometer or by lunar distance method, or both in combination with dead reckoning, the circumstances of the place of its measurement were always consequential. And this was all too apparent, for example, in trials of longitude determination methods under the auspices of the board, as Jim Bennett has recounted. It was also apparent in later years in the routine measurement of longitude on land and at sea by members of exploring expeditions and of the Royal Navy. who traversed, measured, and charted the globe. So contingency was always important. Making astronomical observations on board ship was a difficult business, and yet without them, checks on dead reckoning or on the varying rate of chronometers might not otherwise be available on a long voyage without regular landfall. Running aground gave a compelling sense of place, no matter how much your instruments and charts might insist in combination that you were miles off the coast. Accurate determinations of longitude at sea could only be of use if the charts you were carrying were themselves based on prior accurate determinations. And this was, as I recall, the problem with the Winterton's longitude determinations. I showed you a picture of that a moment ago. An example of the contingency of chronometer use, and one of my favorites, and here apologies to those who attended a conference in California in January. This is one of my jokes from that conference. Captain John McClure, when surveying the coast of India in 1787-88 for the East India Company, had a lot of trouble with the box chronometer he was carrying. It was in the habit of stopping when being wound. He found that if he held the key still and turned the chronometer around it, the instrument would keep going. He reported that since adopting that practice, it had kept much better time. A letter in the board's collection, in the digitised collection now, from James Inman, who'd gone with Matthew Flinders on the Investigator. He reported to Maskelyne in 1803 from Garden Island in Sydney Harbour on the numerous problems with the board's instruments that had been carried on that voyage. The chronometer, he observed, worked better when cleaned and when the cockroaches which had built their nests among the wheels had been removed from it. So much then for the disenchantment of the world, right? At the risk of sounding too much like some Latourian inversion, we might say that it is distance that lends disenchantment. When we get up close, longitude measurement practices look enchanted, at least to me. Partly to test this proposition, a few weeks ago, I examined in the India office records in the British Library the logbooks of a number of East India Company ships. This, incidentally, was a muscular archival experience, still to be had. An experience of order issues, heavy tomes, volume rests, pencils, page weights. So grab it while you can. The logbooks suggested to me, as they have to others, notably Andrew Cook, some of the realities of finding longitude at sea. Even commanders who had a deep interest in promoting longitude determination, such as Joseph Huddart, who I bring in simply because there's this marvellous picture of him. But the journals of his voyage in 1778-79 in the ship Royal Admiral were among those I examined. And Huddart and others were sparing in their determinations of longitude by observation. Long stretches of the voyage were guided only by the dead reckoning values of longitude that were routinely recorded, and importantly by an awareness of the likely serious imprecision of those values. Occasional observations might be made to correct the longitude being recorded by dead reckoning, but errors of 4 or 5 degrees or several hundred miles, depending on latitude, were common. Of course, arriving at a place of known longitude also enabled the dead reckoning to start anew without carrying accumulated errors. Before the 1780s, when the usual route to India was via the Mozambique Channel, perhaps you can see here. This is a marvellous source, which I won't go into. Perhaps some of you know of it, but it's a sort of an accumulated trace of voyage routes. When the usual route was via the Mozambique Channel here, ships often stopped at the Comoro Islands, that there, where they fixed their position. those islands were also commonly used as a zero meridian for the balance of the voyage. After a long spell in open sea, it was important to know when to get serious about longitude again. And when that point came, there was, in Haddart's case, as in others, a flurry of astronomical observations to determine longitude until land was sighted. From the 1780s onwards, voyages increasingly eschewed the Mozambique Channel and headed into the Southern Ocean, taking advantage of prevailing winds. On this route, getting serious again about longitude came in deciding when to turn north for the East Indian coast or for the Malacca Strait. When chronometers came to be carried on East India Company ships later in that decade of the 1780s, they might be used in a similar tactical fashion, though often alongside lunar distance determinations as a check. So, on a ship that was comfortably in open sea, the longitude need not be and was not pursued with precision. To follow the journal of a trading ship closely, to travel vicariously with her crew, passengers, and cargo, is to enter an enchanted world in which the exercise of judgment and skill guided the selective pursuit of scientific precision. Precision was obviously more to the fore on a surveying voyage or a voyage of discovery than on a trading one, and there are a number of journals of such voyages in this digital collection that can now be followed at our leisure, without the need for a trip to London or Cambridge or for pencils or page weights. But even on survey, the practice of longitude measurement retained characteristics of an art, as illustrated again in this collection by the instructions issued in the 1820s to captains carrying chronometers in order to test them. They're very interesting instructions to read. As was mentioned earlier, in recent years, scientific researchers coming from other disciplinary perspectives have been systematically digitizing data from large numbers of old ships' logs, mainly for the information they can give about past climate to help in the charting of global changes of such concern to us now in this era of the Anthropocene. As a byproduct of this research, we can learn a great deal about the practices of longitude determination and or confirm impressions garnered from less statistically significant samplings of logs. Here, for example, is a representation developed by Eric Freeman and his colleagues of the places where observations of all sorts, this is not just longitude by observation, but this is observations of all sorts, places where observations were most commonly made by ships of the East India Company during their voyages to the east. The color-coded indication, right, the redder the pixel, the observationally hotter the spot, shows that observations were most commonly made when turning east after the long swing west in the Atlantic, when approaching and leaving the Cape of Good Hope, and when approaching the Indian coast or parts further east. The places of relative observational quietude are also apparent. This fascinating cumulative representation of observational practice on board East India Company ships confirms Andrew Cook's findings about the limited demand for longitude determination by elaborate methods on such voyages. The point that I wish to make is that longitude, as usually conceived in the workings of the board in London and aboard a voyaging ship, were subtly different entities. As a forum for examining, evaluating, and enabling longitude determination, the board was truly significant. But place matters, and when that place was on board ship, the Board of Longitude and its disenchanted, science-governed world were a long way off. On East Indiamen engaged in private trade, when commanders and other officers typically carried and used their own instruments, including timepieces, there was a sense in which those commanders owned and controlled their position. On board ship, the accurate determination of longitude also took its place among a range of other, often more urgent and consequential concerns. Only at certain times and places did longitude really matter. Where it did, and when it was observed, situation made its mark in more than the desired fashion. I've concentrated those remarks on the finding of longitude, but the role of the board in this was, of course, significant, if not central. But I've tried to indicate in a particular instance the context of use of longitude fixing was profoundly important. One of the great strengths of the Board of Longitude project and this digitisation project is that it has taken these matters of context very seriously. In doing so, it has encouraged an appreciation of the board's diverse roles, activities and significances in the wider relations of science, technology and culture. In my basement in Sydney still are those notes and cards that I inscribed in the 1970s as I pored over a minor portion of the board's archives. Perhaps it's time to recycle them now that I have such marvellous access on the worldwide interweb. My wife would certainly be delighted at the thought, but I can't help thinking that something might be lost, and here is the reactionary in me coming out. There are and there should be limits to the universalizing impulse. This said, there's no doubt about the tremendous documentary and historical value of this online edition of the Board of Longitude papers that we're here to celebrate, and I look forward enormously to getting stuck into it from the comfort of my office in Maroubra, New South Wales, just up the road from Botany Bay, 33.9667 degrees south, 151.1667 degrees east. Congratulations are in order. Simon, Richard, Rebecca, all the staff and students on the project, the National Maritime Museum, HBS at Cambridge, Hugh Jones and the Cambridge University Library Digitisation team, the project's funders, JISC, and its supporters, in short, all who've had a hand in constructing this vessel are to be congratulated. They're to be congratulated for their vision, for their careful scholarship, and for their hard work. Collectively, you've brought us successfully to the point where this project can be launched this evening upon the digital ocean, and your accomplishment will feed the labours of other people in their different places around the world, physical world and disciplinary world, for many years to come. So thank you very much.